Hi, my name is Elise Spicer, and I'm very excited to share with you the research today, a collaboration with my co-author Carrie Woods at the University of Puget Sound. And we just published a paper that I want to share, so feel free to ask afterwards if you need access to that paper. And we're going to talk about biotic interactions in epiphyte ecology and evolution. Now we know that our world is full of a diversity of biotic interactions, ranging from some of these very charismatic mutualisms, positive interactions, things like the sea anemone, clownfish here, things we can't see underground, like mycorrhizae and their plant hosts, brood parasitism, all the way to these very charismatic predation events that you can see down at the bottom. And understanding this diversity of biotic interactions in nature has really been one of the core goals of ecology and evolution. And it's not just sort of interesting, it also really guides our ecological theory. So these are just two representations of theories that are their major ecological theories. Everything from Ehrlich and Raven's sort of why is the world green, thinking about these interactions between herbivores and their plant hosts and this sort of co-evolutionary defending. Then on the right, we have sort of a depiction of the Jansen-Connell hypothesis, really thinking about these species-specific enemies and how they can actually drive the hyper-diverse tropical forests. So these are just two major examples of how biotic interactions have been driving ecological and evolutionary theory. Now, it's not any surprise, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you think about many of our ecological theories that are started in trees. Now, trees are most of the biomass of forests across the world, but they actually end up not being the majority of the diversity of plants. And so that's what I want to tell you about today is some of these other types of plants. And if you're interested sort of in the diversity distributions of plants, I would be happy to talk more afterwards as well. I have been thinking about this for several years, and basically my take-home message of much of my PhD was that trees really make up the minority of plant species in both tropical and temperate forests. So temperate is really only 7% of the vascular plant species, and in tropical it's 30. So what I want to talk about today is some of these other plants that make up the majority of those species. Now, highlighted in pink is this word on the right, epiphytes. And epiphytes make up about 20% of neotropical forests. That's where this study is from. But globally, these plants that grow up in the canopy non-parasitically make up about 10% of vascular plant species. Those are the epiphytes. Now, they all are very charismatic and a big part of tropical forests, like this orchid that you see here, that never have a root connection to the ground, those holophytes. But they actually come in lots of different forms. So in temperate zones, we also see a lot of epiphytes up in the canopy, and these are more likely to be bryophytes. So these are non-vascular plants that are growing up there too. And in some forests, like the temperate forests of the Pacific Northwest in the US or in southwestern Canada, there's actually more biomass in, 4 times more biomass in the leaves and the structures of epiphytes than what you see in the leaves of their host trees themselves. So we really set out to think of this very broad question with this review. Are biotic interactions that we know are drivers of plants that are rooted in the ground also really ubiquitous in epiphytes? Do we see them there too up in the canopy? So we divided this up into sort of 3 sub-questions. The first is, in which epiphyte groups have biotic interactions been studied? So I want to just clarify for you that we actually had quite a broad net thinking about what epiphytes are. So these orchids and bromeliads, those larger vascular epiphytes, that's on the left. We also looked at all these non-vascular plants, these bryophytes, mosses, liverworts, all of that. And we also included lichens. So that's that mutualism on the right. So all 3 of these types we have in this review I'm going to tell you about. We also have sort of thinking about which types of interactions. There's sort of 4 major modes that we looked at. Looked at epiphyte animal interactions, epiphyte microbe interactions, epiphyte interactions, and then also epiphytes and their host, which is kind of unusual for or unique to epiphytes since they live on another live plant. And all of this I'm going to be talking about is actually from the epiphytes perspective. So thinking about what those interactions are, how they're affecting the focal epiphyte. Finally, and this is sort of summarizing or bringing together this review, what are the gaps in the literature so we can know where we should be moving forward. This was a systematic review. We basically looked on the Web of Science and we did a sort of a multi-step filtering process. I'm happy to talk more or field questions online about this, but we filtered it down to be 304 articles eventually that we analyzed for this review. So first, getting at the first question, which are the epiphyte groups that we're looking at? What do we know about them? I'm going to be showing you several figures that look like this, and I'm going to use these same icons throughout. So vascular plants, that's that bromeliad you're going to see, non-vascular, those mosses, and then that lichen. These are going to indicate what groups I'm talking about. In this particular graph, you're going to see the number of publications up on your y-axis. Now, perhaps not surprising, the vascular plants made up the vast majority of this group. Of all of the papers that we looked at, those 307, over 200 of them were focused on vascular plants only. Now you can see those two different colors of green on that bar are two different types of vascular epiphytes. Some that are always in the canopy, those are those holoepiphytes like a bromeliad or an orchid. And then there are also those hemiepiphytic plants, things like figs that germinate in the canopy and then send roots down to the ground later. You can see overall we had a very few number of non-vascular plant epiphyte biotic interactions papers, only 22 total, and then 42 for lichens. Then I'm sort of giving it away a little bit with these pictures. What were the interactions that we observed most? Well, plant-animal interactions were certainly above and beyond the most that we saw. Over 30% of all of the papers were on plant-animal interactions. So that was the mode that we knew the most about. But we wanted to dig in a little bit deeper. So we also divided it sort of across larger biotic interactions. So here I'm highlighting the one that was most frequently came up in the search. It was pollination. So 36% of our articles were on pollination. And this is a beautiful picture of an orchid bee pollinating an orchid in the tropics. I'm gonna switch our sort of next results just a tiny little bit. So I wanna reorient you. Now I've actually flipped the axes. So on the x-axis, we have those number of publications. On the right is higher and on the left is lower. Same three groups, but now on our y-axis, I actually was really interested in digging into sort of the impact on the epiphyte of these different biotic interactions. So you'll see beneficial to the epiphyte on the top and then detrimental on the bottom. Now, first in the vascular plants, as I sort of mentioned already, pollination and dispersal are by far the most common, over 100 articles that we saw on that interaction. In non-vascular plants, it was very different. So, of course, pollination doesn't happen in these, but dispersal is certainly important. But we did not find any articles that actually were published on bryophyte dispersal per se. We also saw a much higher number of articles on competition and commensalisms. Finally, in lichens, we saw a very different pattern again, where herbivory was the most commonly studied biotic interaction. You'll note that, of course, this does look a little different across the different groups. Interestingly, I would actually, from theory, predict the opposite, where sort of more of our positive interactions or epiphyte interactions certainly should be in those vascular plants, and then it should be in some of those non-vascular plants and lichens because they're very early successional, but then maybe more of those late successional vascular plants, we might expect more of that sort of competition dynamics. That is not what the literature is at right now, but in part that's because it hasn't really been tested much at all. So this is kind of an interesting result that hopefully we'll dig into in the future. And just to sort of summarize what those gaps were that we found, for one, the majority of what we know is about epiphyte host and epiphyte animal interactions. I didn't really talk too much about epiphyte host interactions. There was a great review paper a few years ago specifically about vascular epiphyte host interactions. And then we also had a lot of those pollination articles, which are driving the animal interaction one. On the other hand, we had very few of these epiphyte microbe interactions and epiphyte interactions comparatively. And in particular, given the importance of microbes to tropical terrestrial plants and the high diversity of epiphytes, I think these are really big areas that we still need to discover more. And that's really what I've been trying to do. In the next couple of slides, I just want to give you sort of a taste for what some of the work that I do in my upcoming lab. I'll be moving to Lehigh University in a year. So I just want to give you sort of a taste of what that looks like. And if you're an early career scientist and you're looking to maybe be a lab tech, or if you are interested in starting a PhD, I will be looking and recruiting for students. So I am really interested in these sort of positive interactions in these non-vascular epiphytes. So all I'm going to show you is one data slide here. On the x-axis, we see initial mass, and basically all that means is as you're going across that x-axis, you get a higher amount of epiphytes. So then the relative growth is a metric of performance. If you have a positive slope, that means the more epiphytes you get together, if they're increasing per capita, if they're increasing their performance, it means that they're helping each other out. That's facilitation. If it's a negative slope, it means the more epiphytes you get together, each individual is doing worse, which means it's competition. And we found overwhelming, for the first time actually in epiphytic bryophytes, we found overwhelmingly positive interactions. So the more epiphytes you put together, you do have this sort of positive slope. So they're helping each other out. And that is what I would predict from these early successional species. Now, I also have long-term studies in the tropics. That was a temperate project. And what I'm doing is actually I climb up into the canopy every year in the Santa Fe National Park in central Panama. And I have these beautiful permanent plots that I have in 30 trees. So what you can see across these last 5 years I've been working here is that we're actually seeing pretty rapid succession of epiphytes reaccumulating on these areas. So that's another really cool dynamic we're looking at. Finally, we've really started to open a little bit into the microbial world. So this is just about a month and a half ago. I was in Washington State with 2 undergraduates, one from Yale University and one from the University of Puget Sound. And we're just starting to look at these microbes that are also up in the canopy associated with these bryophytes and these epiphytes. So kind of taking a step back, why do we even care about these plants that are up in the canopy? Well, understanding these interactions can be really important both for ecological and evolutionary theory because we can expand some of those theories that are based in ground-rooted plants and then see if they're general to all plants or if that's sort of a rooted specific theory. So it's really generalizing these sort of theories into a new plant group. And another great example of actually these opportunities for active restoration and management, there was one paper we found in this review where they put out the mycorrhizal mutualist on these urban forests in Singapore, and the orchids in fact came. So there was a higher population of orchids when you kind of use those mutualisms to your advantage with management. So with that, I will stop and am happy to field any questions online or in the app. And I very much encourage you, if you're interested in this research or potentially coming and joining us at Lehigh University in a year, please reach out to me because I have 2 open positions for a year from now. My information is here, and thank you again for your attention.